Josie Gaillard retired from the solar industry in 2008 after helping SunPower grow from a struggling startup to a multinational company with close to $1 billion in sales and the world's most efficient solar panels. Her current passion, solving climate change. She is deeply interested in what motivates people to act, enjoys solving complex problems with others, and places a high value on life lessons she gained raising a child. She currently serves as a commissioner on Menlo Park's Environmental Quality Commission, where she co-wrote the city's Climate Action Plan, which is one of the leading ones in the country, and also serves on the board of Carbon Free Silicon Valley. Josie has a Bachelor's of Arts from Princeton and a Master's of Business Administration from Berkeley's Haas School of Business. Thank you, Josie.
Absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Take it away.
And you can see my screen okay?
Perfect.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, Sean and team at Redwood Energy. You guys are you're really leading the path forward for decarbonization in California. And so I'm just so grateful for the work that you do and to be a part of the conference today. So as Sean mentioned, I'm serving on Menlo Park's Environmental Quality Commission. We passed a climate action plan in June of last year, where we set an aggressive goal of achieving a 90% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. We knew that was very aggressive. Some people sort of laughed and said that's not achievable, but we figured better to set a bold goal and then really work toward it, like take it seriously. So that's what we're doing. You can see kind of where we started as a city in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions and where we're headed. I guess what I'll just point to here is the yellow piece of the pie graph, which is our natural gas emissions related to natural gas consumption in buildings in that 2017 pie graph, which is our most recent greenhouse gas inventory data. So that's what we wanted to tackle. At least starting out in terms of the policies that we pass, we knew that there's a long tail on the assets, gas-fired assets in buildings. So we realized that if we wanted to try to achieve this, 90% reduction by 2030, we needed to stop installing new gas appliances immediately and then find some way to accelerate the retirement of the ones that, for example, are being installed today in Menlo Park. So first order of business, among all of the 6 main actions that we're tackling in this year in Menlo Park was this number 1 action, which is to explore policies and programs to convert 95% of our existing buildings to all electric. And for those on the call who don't know, we're one of the 40 cities in California that has passed a REACH code, essentially banning the use of natural gas in new construction. So most of the buildings that will exist in 2030 in Menlo Park exist today. So it's not a huge growth area in terms of new construction. So tackling existing buildings, which is really thorny, has been a focus. So we've spent the last 6 months or so since the cap was passed, kind of getting our ducks in a row and preparing to, we're exploring different policies that the city will pass to restrict the continued use of natural gas appliances in buildings. We've decided to take an approach, we're calling it, sort of casually a burnout ordinance, although we've thought about other names, Electrification Ordinance. The idea is that, the city is not going to come into someone's building and rip out their gas appliances. However, when a gas appliance is reaching the end of its useful life, the idea is that we would disallow residents from installing a new gas appliance. And again, that is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions for the city, but it's also to really help our residents who would otherwise be installing assets that will likely become stranded during their lifetime. So if a natural gas furnace lasts 30 years, it's very likely that natural gas will no longer be distributed to people's homes in California, before the end of that asset's useful life. So there's a way in which we're helping residents, we would be helping residents avoid that. Okay, so what are the elements of an electrification policy? You know, these are things that now we have people working on the legal aspects of it, the technical aspects. You know, does the equipment exist to do this? I think we all know from being on the call today that yes, it's absolutely doable from a technical perspective. Is it possible to find someone to install all the equipment you need to convert from a home from gas to electric? Mixed answers on that one. I think there are installers, but it's sort of spotty, at least in the Bay Area. And the pricing is really all over the place, I think reflecting the fact that there aren't enough installers yet. So the market isn't developed enough or competitive enough yet. You know, this kind of comes back to the legal questions, although it gets into a cost question for the city, is if we pass a burnout ordinance or something similar, how would it be enforced, and do we have the staffing to enforce it? And then finally, maybe the most important question to the policymakers, other than the legal question, is it affordable? So in order to not have huge political blowback, those of us who are supporting the creation of this policy need to prove that it is affordable to most people. And if it's not affordable for everyone, to propose a sort of a phased-in application of the ordinance. So the basic questions we were trying to answer was, number one, what does it cost to fully electrify an existing single-family home in Menlo Park? So at this point, we plan to expand the analysis, but at this point, we're just trying to keep it simple to start and addressing single-family homes. Eventually, we will need to cover multifamily, and I was happy to see, you know, other speakers today looking at, you know, analyzing multifamily and other building types. But we kept it simple to start, just looking at single-family homes. Question number two: can we make the transition costs affordable enough to pass an ordinance? You know, there's a difference between it being completely cost competitive from day one and being affordable enough to be able to pass the ordinance. Hopefully there's some understanding that we're in a climate crisis and no one's going to get rich electrifying their home. So the question is, you know, how affordable does this need to be? So we need to make it affordable enough. Number three, what levers do the policymakers and utilities have to achieve affordability? And then, for example, financing, interest rates, electricity rates, et cetera. What pieces of the puzzle are missing right now? And then, you know, are there lessons to be learned from development of the rooftop solar installation market, which I was got to see kind of get off the ground really in California in the early 2000s. Okay, so in order to address this question, I have worked with Tom Cabot, who I want to give a huge shout out to, who together we have developed a model that basically tries to answer the question of affordability. So there's tons of inputs to the model, and some are costs, some are, you know, assumptions about electricity rates and gas rates, and, you know, hundreds of assumptions, including load modeling across the day for each of the devices that we'll show. But I'll just run you through some of the assumptions, and then we can get to the conclusion and hopefully, or get to our conclusions and hopefully leave some time for questions. Okay. So again, we're talking about a single family home in Menlo Park. Many of the homes built in Menlo Park were built around the middle of the last century. And in this case, we're assuming that there have been maybe some energy efficiency upgrades, like attic insulation and duct insulation, no wall insulation, however, and no major remodel. The home is a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, so 1,500 square feet, 100 amp electrical service, which would be the original service when the home was built. So, and well, you'll see later in the analysis, we're assuming that stays at 100 amps, that it doesn't need to be upgraded. And then we're also assuming that the homeowner has good credit, which if you look at the income distribution for our city, and granted our city is not even probably typical for all of California, and certainly not typical of the nation, given that we live in a very prosperous areas in Silicon Valley. However, for the purposes of our policy, we're assuming that roughly 2/3 of the population has pretty good credit and can access financing. Okay, so we put two states into the model. One, the starting state is the water heater that someone currently uses is gas, as is the space heating gas furnace. Clothes drying is a gas dryer, cooking on a gas range, having all their vehicles use gasoline, no solar, no stationary battery, and 100 amp service. The end state was a high efficiency heat pump water heater, heat pump HVAC, clothes drying, switched to a hybrid heat pump dryer, similar to what Whirlpool currently offers, which I own. And then cooking and induction range vehicle fuel is switching to all electric. So the fuel would be electricity via the home EV charger. Solar is 6 kW system, a stationary battery of 13.5 kilowatt hours, and staying with the 100 amp service. All right, so some of our assumptions related to finance and just other key assumptions. And like I said, there's just hundreds of assumptions. So I'm just pulling out what I think are what would be the most interesting to people. But the model obviously makes even more detailed assumptions than this. Okay, so we are assuming that the project will be financed and that the loan has a term of 20 years. So it could be done through a home loan, a HELOC, or with the solar industry. A lot of third-party lenders came in, in the early 2000s and really broke open that market. So we're assuming that something like that could happen, and that could be facilitated here in Menlo Park. The loan interest rate, we assumed at 5% fixed, which is fairly high. I think, that's what I can go access just picking up the phone and calling, a US bank. But with some negotiation and kind of setting up a special deal, I think it's possible we could get that lower through public financing or support from the CCA. Obviously, providing, for example, a subsidy on the interest, those could come down quite a bit. Rooftop solar, we assumed was possible to install it as low as $2 a watt, which Tesla currently offers. Stationary battery cost at roughly $700 a kilowatt hour, which again, Tesla offers roughly that. Battery capacity. So we assume that the homeowner has a battery and uses it, 40% stays in reserve for outages, and then the other 60% can cycle during the day to basically hedge against the time of use rates. So filling up from solar during the middle of the day and deploying during the duck head. The federal tax credit, we assumed at 22%. We know it was just extended at 26% for next year, but we don't know what it would be in out years. So it's maybe not the most conservative assumption, but we just assumed 22% of federal tax credit. And we do in this area, our CCA or our CCE, Peninsula Clean Energy just announced a $2,500 heat pump water heater subsidy rebate. So we did assume that. We also assumed PG&E rate, the EV2A rate. We did assume that there was an increase in natural gas rates of 25%, which actually seems quite low over the 20-year term of the loan. So that would be the average increase over the whole term, not per year, but over the whole term. 12,000 vehicle miles per year on the car. You can see the other 5 loads of laundry and 14.5 burner hours on cooking per week. So here's some of the cost assumptions we made on appliance installation, and these are reflective of actual quotes that I've been able to get for my home, which is actually pretty much this typical home. And these are not the highest bids I've gotten. They are the best bids I've been able to get from installers who are rated 4 or 5 stars on Yelp. So again, you can find a huge range of costs for many of these, heat pump, water heater, HVAC installation. So I think over time, there will be a sort of settling out of what those prices are, but that hasn't happened yet. Okay, so the results. What we were able to show is if you finance the incremental cost, I think a previous speaker mentioned this, so not the whole cost, because again, we're assuming the burnout ordinance, the way it's structured would be not forcing someone to retire their perfectly new gas furnace, but forcing them to, once that gas furnace is no longer working, to replace it with a heat pump water heater. The heat pump space heater. The heat pump space heater, in the pricing we found, was roughly double the cost of the furnace. So it would be that sort of additional cost associated with the electric version that we put into the financing. So what would be financed? That would be the incremental expenses for the electrification for the 4 devices that we listed there. Actually 5, including the EV charger. The circuitry required. We do not need a panel upgrade because we're using an amp diet approach, which is, we can talk a little bit more about later. And also the solar and the battery were in the loan. So that you can see in the yellow, the 2160. So that would be the loan payments for the year. There's still some residual electric load. So you're still paying $614 to the utility, which is fine because you have there's a minimum bill with PG&E, so you'd have to pay $120 anyway. But the solar and the battery cover the rest of your electric load, and obviously you've gotten rid of your gasoline expense and your natural gas expense. And again, the result here is to show that you can replace those things with a loan, and then the residual annual electricity costs, and the homeowner comes out a little bit better off. Tom actually did this work, and I want to thank him for that. We just, in the last couple of days, have been looking really closely at when you add a battery in, is it affordable? And the answer is, it is. It really, it adds that reliability for those who, from a policy perspective, a lot of policymakers are hearing from residents who say, you can't, we were having rolling blackouts. Please don't force me to make my home all electric, because then what will I do in a blackout? So even though, it's a little bit of an irrational concern, we think, because most current, new or gas appliances actually don't work. A blower on a furnace, for example, won't work in a blackout. So it's a little bit of an irrational concern, but it still needs to be addressed because it can, it is something people are worried about. So what we're able to show is that having a battery does not make this uneconomic. In fact, it's pretty much neutral to the economics, maybe even helps it a little bit. And it's, and it adds that reliability. Okay, so key findings, and how am I doing on time? Key findings. So electrification is cost neutral from day one to the end customer if it's financed, if it's paired with rooftop solar, if the installation costs are competitive, and if the amount financed is the premium for electrification over gas appliances. So, so the pairing with rooftop solar was key. We found that electrification alone actually didn't have, I think as other speakers have said, the upfront capital costs could not be recouped by the operating savings over the life of the device. So, so putting very cheap rooftop solar into the mix essentially sort of subsidizes the rest of the electrification. Financing is key. This is something that I saw in the solar industry. When I joined the solar industry in the early 2000s, it was really only affordable for people who could write, had $30,000 in cash sitting around who could write that check for the solar. And it was only when banks came in and they approached us actually and said, hey, why are you not offering third-party financing, just like a car loan? And we said, yeah, why are we not doing that? So once we did that, solar became affordable to a whole bunch more people. And at that time, it actually wasn't totally cost neutral, meaning when you financed it, you still had to pay a premium to have the solar over what you were paying for electricity, but people were still willing to do it. It just amortized that upfront capital cost over a longer period of time, 20 years. So the other key consideration here is Tom Cabot has been working on this concept of an amp diet, which helps people avoid electric service upgrades, which can around here at least cost $4,000 or more. And I've heard people say it takes maybe 6 months in queue with PG&E to actually get done. So we're seeing that with just making a few thoughtful choices, especially about water heaters, choosing 15 amp water heaters, for example, over 30 amp water heaters, most people can actually avoid the need for an electric service upgrade. Capital costs for electric appliances, yeah, we're just seeing that they're currently, higher than for gas. And that last piece is adding a battery pays for itself due to the duckhead savings with PG&E's EV2A rate, which has a really big differential of it's almost 31 cents, I think, between off-peak rate of 17 cents and the on-peak, which is 48 cents. So key levers for policymakers and utilities, one is making financing for electrification available to everyone. That's a really key one. So we're working hard on that, and others in other cities, counties, et cetera, that's going to have to be a focus. Streamlining, and that can be private or it can be public. Streamlining city permitting processes can reduce fees. And the quotes I've gotten, the permitting just for the installer to actually do the permits, not to actually pay the permit fee, just for the installer to spend the time applying for the permits can add like 10% to the cost. So that's an area for, like with solar, that's an area for cities to really look at that process and try to, it may be somewhat cumbersome because building officials aren't yet comfortable with heat pumps, but maybe that is an area that we're looking at to try to help streamline that process for people who are trying to electrify. Offering appliance subsidies is something that a lot of the CCEs are doing. And then looking at rate design. So are there favorable electricity rates that could be offered to people who are going all electric, increasing their load? So what else do we need? Again, low interest financing solutions is going to be, I think maybe if I had to pick one thing, I would say the key for really making these types of policies acceptable. And then I said that I thought this was doable for the top 2/3 of the income of folks income-wise here in Menlo Park, but there is a question about how do you make sure that those with poor credit have a solution too. So on-bill utility financing is another is something that would be really helpful. So third-party financing can work, as it's been shown with solar, but making it on the bill, I think, even simplifies it further. And then some education for installers and homeowners about amp diets, because one plumber who comes in and installs the wrong water heater can set someone up for a $4,000 panel upgrade later, not knowing that. So neither the customer knows that, nor the installer. So getting them educated is helpful to avoid those unnecessary panel upgrades. And obviously a more developed and competitive installer market is really going to be important. And then finally, just a couple lessons from rooftop solar. Installation costs will come down with volume. Installation costs in solar have come down, or total install costs in solar have come down something like 75 or 80% since when I was in the industry, actually. So we predicted that, but it's hard to remember that when you're sort of struggling in the moment like we are in the building electrification space. But these costs will come down with volume. Installer training is really key, both to quality and cost, so making sure the customer has a good experience, and keeping those costs down, like I just mentioned about the plumber who maybe made the wrong decision about a water heater for someone. Streamlining permits is really key. That happened in solar, and I think that would be hugely helpful. And it may be that one city can forge the way and make recommendations on permit streamlining, and other cities can follow suit. Stepping down subsidies by volume, that happened in solar, and that was really effective because after a certain number of kilowatts got installed, the rebate for solar went down. So there was sort of this urgency that installers wanted to rush to try to get in line and get those rebates. So I think it also kind of imposes certain discipline on the installer market, because they know that subsidy is going to go away. one risk of offering subsidies for these programs is sometimes the installer just sort of pockets the whole subsidy. And so having them see that it's going to go down over time kind of forces the installer to get more efficient in their installation. We saw that with solar. And then finally, financing can just move this electrification from something that only really dedicated, wealthy environmentalists pursue to something that most people can afford. So that's it. That's Tom, who again is my collaborator on all of this. Tom Cabot and my email. Either of us would be happy to hear from you. And then I'm happy to open it up to questions.
Woo! Fantastic. Man, way to show what Menlo Park is up to, you guys. Could you remind the audience that you guys have like a 2030 goal for completely, right? That's what it is for the carbon neutral economy, or how is it defined by 2030?
Yeah, so by 2030, we want to have a 90% reduction in our greenhouse gases. So that's both buildings, transportation, and waste. And then the remaining 10% we're planning by 2030 to be physically sequestering, although we haven't identified exactly how. But yeah, that's the plan.
Well, you have a blur of questions here. I have to scroll up. Let's see. Okay, so if people want the slide decks, yes, we're going to post them on the website. I gave some detail on the 22% tax credit. Ann Edminster would like to know, did you factor in the cost of the electric vehicle when you were doing the work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We did not. We decided that, there's a question about whether to include the EV charger, and we decided to do it because it sort of is very intertwined with a panel upgrade, all the other questions. So we decided to include that, and we did reap significant gains in terms of the cost savings from the gasoline that's avoided. We figured that the purchase of a car, however, is sort of a separate question and involves lots of other things, like should we include a $30,000 car, a $100,000 car?
Right.
So we decided to exclude that, and we figured that there were still the maintenance cost savings that could be separate and attributed to the car. So anyway.
Fair enough. There's a question, did you evaluate what percentage of rooftops in Menlo Park could hold a 6 kilowatt array, which is...
Right. We have not looked at that yet. No.
There is a question here. Is there a good model, Tor Allen wants to know, is there a good modeling tool for determining the best utility rate for a home with solar plus EV plus all electric?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, we have developed this sort of from the ground up, and I just wanted to mention that Tom and I do plan to make the model that we developed open source. The plan is to write sort of a paper with our findings and then to make it open source. So that will be coming, and you could easily kind of look at different rates. So that might be something you could do, but I'm not aware of a model out there that does that.
Well, I'd be happy to host it on Redwood Energy's site, like your collaborative work with the Watt Diet. Collaborative work, that's wonderful to have a spot for it. Bruce Mass wants to know, does REEL, R-E-E-L, meet Menlo Park's financing needs?